Hey guys, so this is a webinar that is going to walk you through chapter 24 of the textbook. And just apologies from the get-go. My mom is playing piano downstairs, so if you hear that as a background noise, that's what that is. So without further ado, let's get started. Ignore the dates here. These are dates from when I put together this PowerPoint for my class last year. So obviously it is not February 27th. Anyway, one of the most important things that you guys need to realize, you need to understand the underlying causes of the Depression. So first and foremost, the stock market crash. Now realize that the stock market crash was not the be-all and end-all cause of the Great Depression, but ultimately it was a very important barometer of some of the economic anxieties that existed around the year 1929. So first of all, many people got involved in the stock market in the 1920s that had previously stayed away from it. And so what that led to was what we call speculation, just like speculation when it comes to land purchasing. So ultimately, people were buying stock knowing that the more people that would buy it, the greater the price would become, basically, because it would influence the demand of stock. So what this did was it actually created an inflation of the value of different types of stocks. It did not necessarily reflect how well a company is doing. Most of the time when we buy stocks now, they're supposed to reflect the general trend of the company that you're purchasing stock in. So for example, you feel that Apple Computer is a good company to invest in, and you see that they're doing quite well. Maybe they've released a new product like the iPad or the iPad mini, something like that. And you know that if you buy stock that it will likely increase in value because there's more of a demand for the product and it shows that the company is doing better. Well, in the late 1920s, this was not necessarily the case. Some of the rising prices had to do more with the over speculation in the market, basically more people purchasing stock just to sort of get involved in the market and ultimately have more of an effect on what the price would become. So the value of stock, again, had nothing really to do with how well a company was doing, but rather how much speculation was taking place, and that would make the actual value of the company even more inflated. The other thing that was happening was this last bullet point, which is called buying on the margin. And ultimately what that meant was that people could buy stocks and not pay 100% of whatever the value of their stock was. Normally buying on the margin excuse me, involved paying as little as 10% of the overall value of your stock. So for example, if you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, if you were buying on the margin, you only had to put down $10, and you would still ultimately be purchasing $100 worth of stock. So what did that do? That got more and more people involved, again, in investing in the stock market, but made it so that they did not have to invest 100% in the stock market. But of course, if you are buying on the margin and there's some sort of recall, which of course happens after the crash, people ultimately realize that investing in the market is not a good thing. It caused people who were trying to get their loan money back, people who had issued easy credit, were trying to recall loans, and everyone who bought on the margin was supposed to have 100% of the value of the stock that they purchased, and it just wasn't there. So buying on the margin was a way that people could get involved in things like the stock market, but it was very risky when it came to different practices of paying back. So the market crash of 1929, again, this is one of the many things that ultimately causes the Depression. Many people argue that the stock market crash was not actually a cause, but rather just an indicator of the instability of the economy in the late 1920s. So realize that Black Tuesday, which is ultimately seen as the major day, that September day where ultimately the stock market plummeted to this again, not to the ultimate low, which it doesn't hit until 1932, as you can see here, but just crashed, I mean, virtually 200 points in just one day. This is what caused the initial panic. And again, as you can see, even when it hit this low point after Black Tuesday, it still was not even close to as low as it had been prior to the Roaring 20s. So ultimately, if that panic had not ensued even further, and of course exacerbated itself with some other problems that lead to the absolute bottoming out of the market in 1932, perhaps the Great Depression would not have been as serious as it actually was. So again, just to reiterate, the stock market crash was not necessarily a cause of the depression, but rather it was a barometer of the country's economic condition. That's really, really important to understand. Okay, if anything, it kind of just reflected people's overall insecurities of the market, which had been taking place throughout the 20s, but people continued to take risks because they were generally profitable. Okay, so I'm just going to get all of these little graphics here. This is kind of a very budget graphic to show some of the different economic cycles that are producing or exacerbating the effects of the Great Depression in the late 1920s. So ultimately, when the market crashed, one of the first things that we start to see happen is, well, you could say there are two major things that happen at the beginning. One is massive unemployment. Right. Ultimately, many banks in particular closed their doors very quickly, and other businesses realized that it is no longer profitable. They are no longer able to capitalize on widespread production. And so the first thing that they do to try to save money is try to eliminate unnecessary jobs as much as possible. The other thing that's going to happen along with mass unemployment is a general decline in purchasing power. This also has to do with the decline of the amount of currency that's in circulation, of course. Right? So ultimately, less people have jobs, of course, unemployment, and less people ultimately have money in their pockets to allow them to buy things, whether or not they are necessary items or just general consumer goods, things that people respond to when they see advertisements. All of these things are going to start to decline. You don't have a job, you don't have money in circulation, you cannot purchase. And of course, that also has to do with the level of productivity. Now, if we don't have very many people employed, of course, that is going to make it so that less items are being produced in the marketplace, right? Less of a demand for products and less people employed means less productivity. And of course, again, this is going into purchasing power. If different manufacturing businesses in particular, of course, realize that we are still demilitarizing after World War I, all of these things are going to make it so that there is less of an emphasis on production, and of course, less jobs available, less money available. So not only do we not have production, but we don't have people purchasing things. So there's not necessarily a need to produce as rapidly as we did during the First World War. So all of this is supposed to be an equal sign, these two rectangles. All three of these major factors are all leading to a vicious economic cycle that will be indicative of the patterns of the Great Depression. Okay, so again, unemployment increases, purchasing power and productivity decrease, and all of these things lead to a general economic cycle that is very difficult to break in the early years of the Great Depression. So other underlying causes that are very, very significant, realize that more and more, I mentioned earlier that there were bank failures. Many banks rely particularly on deposits. Almost all banks do, of course. This is the way that they run, right? So ultimately, a consumer is going to put a certain amount of money, of their actual money into a bank. And that bank then ultimately has the permission to put that money into circulation, issuing it into loans, right? So that it can do things like issue other credit or also, of course, repay people who have taken out different types of loans, repay people who may or may not actually have money invested in the bank. Or, of course, if people want to take out their deposits, that other deposits should have that capital available so that they can do that. So, right, customer A deposits $100,000 and customer B needs $50,000, some of the principal that customer A just deposited, customer B can actually take, and it will work, right? But ultimately, since banks were so heavily reliant on deposits, since so few people actually had money to readily deposit into a bank, it made it so that banks who had issued very easy credit previously to speculators in particular were unable to recall their loans and unable to get any money back. This caused a general panic in the banking industry, and it caused many, many banks to ultimately fold, to close their doors, and to actually not have the money available that people had deposited. There was absolutely no such thing as deposit protection prior to the Great Depression, right? So this is very significant that many people, when they started to panic after the market crash in 1929, turned to the bank to try to get their money back so that they could put it in a place that they felt was safer. And this could no longer happen because banks also could not retrieve all of the funds that they had loaned out. Okay, what this is also going to lead to, which is arguably even more of a long-standing effect, is that customers don't trust banks anymore. So what this means is that instead of depositing money into their local bank where they could possibly earn interest, or at the very least have a safe place, or a seemingly, at least prior to the crash, safe place to put their money, they would much rather hold on to it themselves. And so the general pattern and the general association of people literally stuffing their cash under the mattress actually became quite true. Many people realized that, or many people at least came to believe that the most safe way that they could manage their money would be to control it themselves. But of course, if money is not in circulation, then it makes the entire economy become stagnant. But nonetheless, people losing trust in the bank and then withdrawing their funds, placing it under their mattresses, this was very, very significant and definitely one of the causes of the Depression. So again, just to sound like a broken record, but to really understand some of the major causes of the Depression, the more unemployment we have, the less ability we have, of course, to produce, right? There are no longer as many people that are working in manufacturing, so we're not producing as much. That also means people aren't spending as much, so that means that there's less currency in circulation, and all of these things lead to what we consider the Depression, just because it lasted for so much longer than previous recessions had. Okay, so Herbert Hoover is president at this point. He was elected in 1928, and arguably he historically did very, very little for curbing the effects of the Great Depression. So realize that the unemployment rate by 1932, by the year that Hoover was elected out of office, when FDR replaces him, the unemployment rate was larger than any other president had ever seen. It was approximately, on a national average, it had reached 25%. Literally 1 in every 4 individuals in the United States was out of the job. Now, to put that into perspective, in the 2008-2009 recession, our unemployment rate was closer to 10%. So this is a much, much bigger deal, and it's on a much more massive scale. And the traditional forms of relief, things that Herbert Hoover had done himself when he was in the Chamber of Commerce during both Coolidge and Harding's administration, he could not visualize these same type of relief programs working for the entire country. They were just not large enough. Also, he could not rationalize giving individuals money just because they were not employed. He was a general believer in giving money to large organizations rather than an individual. So this is also a little bit problematic, and we'll get back to that. Okay, so again, one of the things also that makes Hoover become increasingly unpopular is that Congress was working to make certain acts. They were trying to basically pass certain laws that would provide some relief to the unemployed on an individual basis. But Hoover, again, being a believer in giving aid only to groups rather than individuals, vetoed these measures because he did not believe that that was the way to solve the problems of the Depression. He did, however, sponsor some other programs that had mixed, if any, success whatsoever. So one of the things that he organizes was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which we could call the RFC. Realize that the Great Depression is full of acronyms to remember everything, so RFC is just one. But ultimately, what it tried to do, it tried to pump money into business organizations, but it did not do anything to restore purchasing power. It did not do anything to put money back into circulation. So its ultimate goal of giving people more confidence in investing in businesses was not successful at all. And if anything, all that the RFC did was prevent future banks from failing. Another thing that a lot of people argue was that Hoover in general as president was in denial of the severity of the Depression. That in 1928 and 1929, he really fundamentally believed that the way to dig the country out of the Depression was to do nothing, because that was the way that previous economies, previous systems had solved themselves, was rather than to panic, just to continue along with the practices of laissez-faire capitalism. And so you could say that he was sort of generally vetoing measures to aid the unemployed. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was rather minimalistic, because the idea was that less government intervention in the economy actually was better. And we'll see that once we get to the election of 1932, that the majority of the public opinion did not agree with this assessment. Okay, so one of the major events that takes place shortly before Hoover is elected out of office was the Bonus Army protests. And so the Bonus Army, now there were World War I veterans that were promised a bonus, were promised basically a check from the federal government for their service to the United States during World War I. But like a savings bond, that check was not ready for them yet by the time the Great Depression rolled around. But in 1932, many World War I veterans decided that they needed that money now. They could no longer wait for it. And so a large group of them decided to march in Washington and protest Herbert Hoover's administration and demand that they would get these bonuses sooner rather than later. And these bonuses, again, show kind of a widespread, organized, and quasi-militaristic reaction to the way that the president is handling some of the economic problems. And overall, it is, again, you could say a barometer for the general public opinion's need for major change. Because Hoover does not respond very well to the Bonus Army protests, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who already was campaigning for president at this point, and of course was promptly elected as Hoover's replacement, actually observed the Bonus Army protests and made the assessment that this would get him elected. I mean, basically, this shows how unpopular Hoover was, that all these people who had so recently fought for the country and ultimately supported the kind of laissez-faire economics that Hoover also supported were now marching in the nation's capital against him. So again, 1932 kind of shows you how much the general American public was desiring of change. As you can see, I mean, this is one of the most dramatic landslides of electoral votes in history, right? These are all the states that elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt over Hoover. And so this kind of brings the question about whether or not Hoover was ultimately to blame for the effects of the Great Depression. Many people actually make the argument that FDR did some things in his New Deal programs that were just as controversial, if not more so, than Hoover. And so to say that Hoover was entirely to blame might be a little bit unfair, but nonetheless, by looking at how rapidly the nation's electorate wanted to get him out of office, there is certainly maybe a little bit of scapegoating that we can apply to Hoover, and it may not necessarily be as dangerous as it could be. But certainly, I mean, this is something worth considering, that how many people blamed Hoover by the time 1930 rolled around, or 1932 that is. Just a couple of things actually about FDR's background before I really get into the nuts and bolts of his first 100 days. To kind of think about how interesting it is that this is the person that replaces Hoover. So realize that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he is a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He also was born into privilege. He grew up in the New York City area and was very, very wealthy growing up. In his early political career, he was stricken with polio, which many people argue dramatically changed the way that he interacted with the public, and it overall kind of changed his just general self-perception, and maybe gave him a little bit of a challenge to his ego that was necessary in the deepest elements of the Depression that the country was facing at this point. Right, just the general idea that he had been through something very devastating himself, and that made him qualified to pull the country out of the Depression. Just like many people in history argue that a president who has had a war record, that has been distinguished with some sort of military victory, would also be good for president for the same reason, right? So thinking about FDR's health problems in the early elements of his political career are actually significant. So he was New York governor for 2 terms, and when he was governor of New York, he put together what he called a brain trust, which was a team of advisors that were meant to help him implement change. And so he already was definitely considered a progressive type politician, someone who knew that he had to be active, knew that he had to be involved to do things to improve the region that he was governing. So when he takes over as president of the United States, he quickly implements a plan, a 100 days plan. So these are the first 100 days that he is in office, to try to get the economy to start working again. And so some of the very important elements of his first 100 days that we should definitely be familiar with. One is that he declares what's called a bank holiday, right? So basically he made it mandatory for banks to close their doors for 4 days so that they could ultimately reorganize themselves and be prepared to reopen for business, to actually have funds allocated for people who needed withdrawals, and also to make more wise lending practices rather than to issue the easy credit that had gotten them in trouble prior to this period. Also, Congress worked in tandem with FDR to pass acts of legislation that in general strengthened the banking system. Also realize that it's not just FDR directly that's working during these 100 days, that the first 100 days that FDR is president, this is also an emergency session of Congress, right? So basically Congress pledges not to cease working until they have ultimately revived the economy in terms of industry and agriculture, and also performing general emergency relief to the individuals that need it most. They make it their priority to continue operating for those 100 days in an emergency session to make sure that the country is returning in a positive direction before Congress takes a recess. Other things that are significant. This is an image of FDR actually giving a radio press conference. He was very, very well known for his fireside chats or his radio broadcast to the general public to give an update about how the nation was doing. This was something that no president had previously done. He was championing a new form of technology, and it also generally restored a general sense of hope and faith in the government among the average voter, the average member of the public. So again, the first 100 days, particularly FDR's style of the first 100 days, and realize he champions this with his communication through the fireside chats, were all meant to reinstill confidence in the general American people. Okay, so some key programs. Not necessarily going to spend too much time talking about the details of these, but again, you can see they're all different programs that have acronyms that are associated with them. So all of these are different programs that you guys should be familiar with. All of them are really key, again, New Deal programs that are meant to create jobs and stimulate the economy in some way. Realize that the Civilian Conservation Corps, this was actually an organization that sent young men off to an area where they could work and send part of their paycheck back home. So it wasn't necessarily a very lucrative career. It wasn't a very high, a profitable job that the CCC gave to its workers, but rather it gave them a job, of course, and it gave them more of a source of confidence than had previously existed. The AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is very significant because it's not only trying to make farmers reduce the amount of land that they farm, and also just generally trying to provide them with some type of relief, but it's also working towards educating farmers to use more sustainable agricultural practices that would prevent some of the environmental problems that existed in the 1920s that made the Depression that much worse. So for example, they're working on just basic elements, basic practices like crop rotation, which made it so that farmers would not dry out their land as quickly and make it so that their farms would be more profitable. The Tennessee Valley Authority, also a huge job creator, and also a program that brought technological advantages to the areas in the Tennessee Valley who received more sources of electricity, and of course different types of jobs for the people that lived in that area that actually were put to work building those dams. I mean, that's just a cursory overview of some of the major programs that were incorporated in the first 100 days. By no means is it a master list, but all of these acronyms are things that are worth memorizing. Okay, so the New Deal is relatively quickly criticized by certain people who think that it is too liberal, it is too left-wing, right? And so there are certain elements of a conservative opposition to the New Deal that are very much worth considering. So first of all, many conservatives argued that the New Deal was actually socialistic in nature, that actually there was too much government involvement in regulating the economy and also maybe arguably redistributing wealth at the same time. Other critics from the left, from the far left, also said that the New Deal was too timid, that it didn't go far enough to changing and modifying the economy, and again, to redistributing wealth. So realize that there's critique coming from both the right and the left about the powers of the New Deal. Upton Sinclair actually runs for governor of California in the early years of the New Deal, and even though he loses the race, it's significant to just realize that he, again, remember that he was the author of The Jungle, right, the 1906 expose about the meatpacking industry, that just the fact that he runs a gubernatorial race that ended up being quite close shows how important the country's connection to the progressive era still is, and also to remnants of socialism, because Sinclair also arguably wrote The Jungle as sort of a socialist manifesto. So that's very significant as well. Francis Townsend, also arguably a socialist who is looking to redistribute wealth. His plan actually was to provide $200 a month to all citizens over 60 years old. It was his idea that this could be sort of a form of social security that would prevent the elder citizens of the United States from draining too heavily on the federal government's resources. But arguably the most socialistic out of all of these different New Deal planners was Huey Long, who was at that point a senator from Louisiana. He later becomes governor, and he incorporated a program that was called Share Our Wealth. And ultimately he did exactly what the program's title suggests, and that he wanted to redistribute the amount of wealth that was held by different segments of the population. I mean, ultimately, communism or socialism in practice, right? Making it so that everybody had equal access to funds. But that was not a particularly popular program, and that is highlighted by the fact that Huey Long was assassinated in 1936. And this also ends the possible threat of Huey Long running as a third-party candidate against Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election. Okay, just a couple of graphics here, but again, realize that a lot of the critique about the New Deal was that it was too socialistic in nature. Other things that FDR does that arguably make him seem a little bit more leftist than certain people want him to be. The WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, was a program that pumped billions of dollars into the depressed economy through different government work projects. So again, this was seen as maybe a relief program that was targeted towards individuals, and that was not necessarily popular among people like Hoover, who argued that you should fund an entire organization. Also, it was under FDR that we first established our social security system, which provided modest services to the elderly, as well as some welfare benefits to people who were unemployed or vastly underemployed. And so this was something that was also seen as socialistic. Basically a relief program for a group of people that some argued did not actually deserve those benefits because they either did not work hard enough, or maybe just that they did not work at all, right? The elderly or the overly poor, certain demographics, certain members of the electorate argue that they should fend for themselves. And so Social Security was considered way too leftist by some because of that. Also, the Wagner Act, going back to the protection of unions, the Wagner Act protected workers' rights to organize unions. So realize that unions, which were popular during World War I, declined in popularity in the 1920s, are coming back in the 1930s. Okay, and the Wagner Act is an example of the growing trend to reunionize. Also, another program that makes FDR seem a little bit leftist is the Resettlement Administration. Some people argue that it was overly ambitious, but what it did was it was established to relocate poor farm families. So think about people who were from Oklahoma who had their farms devastated by the Dust Bowl. The Resettlement Organization was a government-funded program to get people out of those devastated agricultural regions and to more productive, profitable ones. But again, this was relief to individuals, so it was considered controversial. Okay, so again, just some graphics. These are advertisements that are actually touting the Resettlement Administration as a way to cure the ills of the economy. And then this is also an advertisement for Social Security, right? Again, programs that were very seriously criticized by more conservative critics of FDR. Okay. There is a general leftward push of the people as well that is definitely worth considering during the Great Depression. So the AFL, which we already are familiar with, the American Federation of Labor, merges with another program or another group called the Committee for Industrial Organization, or the CIO. They merge to become the AFL-CIO, right? So the American Federation of Labor Committee for Industrial Organization. Okay, so what is this meant to do? Now, the purpose of the AFL-CIO was to organize a mass group of production workers, right? This was actually led by John Lewis, who was one of the heads of the United Mine Workers. This drew together actually many communists and other radicals to try to engage in the very dangerous task of building, or in many cases rebuilding, industrial unions. And the AFL-CIO had many, many instances of success. It was particularly successful in the automotive regions of the United States, like Flint, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan as well. You could say that in general, in addition to the formulation of the AFL-CIO, there was an invigorated labor movement, right? More and more people realized that organizing as laborers was key to gaining power in FDR's New Deal coalition, right? Sorry, that's really lame graphics there. But again, realize that the AFL, this was actually a more radical or militant branch that decides to merge the CIO with the AFL and make this AFL-CIO that still exists now, right? Also realize that you can see that more and more people are not necessarily leaning left, but realizing that an increased sense of government involvement in the economy was the way to solve the problems of the Depression by FDR's, again, landslide victory in the election of 1936. Who supports FDR? Well, in general, many of his supporters, traditional white Southern Democrats, so people who were not necessarily likely to support, yes, FDR was a Democrat, but at the same time, he is starting to reflect some social values that were not the same as previous Democrats. This is something that we will continue to talk about, but if you remember, we were already talking about some of the shifts of the Democratic and Republican Party by the 1910s, 1920s. Remember how Al Smith, right, as this Catholic Democrat, is starting to sweep the cities, the urban areas, for the first time in the 1920s. This is going to show we have continued support of the Democratic Party in rural areas, but also in northern big city areas as well. So you see that there are traditional white Southern Democrats that are supporting FDR, but also big city political machines, trade unionists, farmers who were severely hit by the Depression, and also ethnic voters, right? People who were not long established white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, people who had only recently emigrated to the United States, right? So maybe second generation or naturalized immigrants also were turning out in wide support of FDR. Okay, so the West. Realize we already talked in the previous chapter about how the agricultural sector had already hit a low before the Depression struck, right? We should be somewhat familiar with the Dust Bowl, which, let me just get all these little things to show up and then I'll talk about the Dust Bowl. Okay, so the Dust Bowl, again, sort of, it was just a general, it's a term to describe the overall droughts that existed throughout the Great Plains region of the United States. And it was caused by a culmination of poor farming methods, so overusing the land, ultimately that stripped the farmland of its natural vegetation and made it virtually impossible to produce and yield any more crops. And of course, it was the poor farming practices also combined with a drought in the 1920s and early 1930s that made it that much worse. So the government programs that existed in the New Deal were trying to help provide relief and instill better farming practices. So some of these programs, so farmers relief projects like farmers ultimately getting educated, getting trained to plant different crops that actually enriched the soil. So there was a different understanding of crop rotation. Different types of crops actually release different types of nutrients into the soil. And so farmers actually being educated and understanding that helped them produce more sustainable farming practices. Also, the Soil Conservation Service provided assistance to farmers who were engaged in conservation work. So again, that went hand in hand with farmers who were trying to plant crops that enrich the soil, but also engage in more sustainable agricultural methods. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, as we mentioned earlier, provided subsidies to farmers who reduced their acreage. So actually it was making it beneficial to farm less, right? Realize that farmers, landowners who reduced acreage by evicting their tenants and sharecroppers, which is demonstrated in many forms of pop culture, like Grapes of Wrath, where basically the main family is evicted from their property. They were called Okies from Oklahoma. This is a general practice, very, very popular during this time period, right? Just trying to reduce acreage by getting the people who rent your land out of there. Arguably, there was a certain amount of racism that existed in the government New Deal programs as they related to agriculture. There were some examples of officials who responded to racial hostility by carrying out an aggressive campaign against Mexicans and Mexican Americans in particular. Starting in 1929, there was an effort that was supported by the federal government for Mexicans to repatriate, which meant for them to voluntarily deport themselves from the United States back to Mexico. This was seen as a way to provide more jobs for American laborers and to solve the government's problem of needing to provide relief for all individuals, but just not having enough capital. If they denied Mexican American citizenship and forced them to repatriate, they would not have to give them relief funding as well. So to them, it solved multiple problems, as cynical as that may be. This is just an image of migrant farmers from the Great Plains region who are leaving in search of better jobs. Okay, different projects oriented around water in particular. So New Deal water projects. In general, I'm talking about things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was mentioned in a previous slide, building dams across the Tennessee River Valley in order to provide hydroelectric power in particular, and also to provide jobs for the people who built these dams. All these different water projects, also the Hoover Dam was a very popular one. They allowed urban growth, right? So they basically allowed cities to grow faster because water oftentimes was redirected into those areas. Like the Hoover Dam ultimately made cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas possible because they were so arid previously to the construction of these dams. It also provided for agricultural expansion and massive irrigation. You can come in, but I'm going to keep talking. Someone's knocking on my door. Come in. But I'm doing a webinar and I don't want to stop. My mom's in here. Okay. Anyway. Thank you. Also, one of the really, really important things that they do is that it promotes flood control, and it's supplied low-cost electricity for individuals who lived in those regions. It did cause some farmers to become immensely wealthy at the expense of other farmers, such as certain farmers gained quite a bit of wealth by these water projects at the expense of Mexican laborers who worked for very low wages. And it did cause a general environmental decline, so for example, the Hoover Dam actually completely changed the ecosystem of the Colorado River, and caused it so that the same type of fish could no longer live in that ecosystem because the water had just completely changed. So realize that even though it has some positive developments for urban growth, they were not across the board positive. This is just an image of the Hoover Dam, so you can see when I'm talking about ecosystem changes, the water that is downstream is still fairly free-flowing, it's still moving fairly quickly, like what a river should do, and the area that is upstream of the dam is virtually stagnant. It is a lake, essentially, not a river, and the water is much colder in this area. People have made an effort to restock it with fish, but it just ultimately could not sustain the same type of ecosystem that existed before the dam was constructed. So that's one of the examples that I mean when I say general economic or environmental decline. Okay. The Great Depression and its effects on Native Americans. We are almost done. Obviously, hopefully you have taken the opportunity to press pause a couple of times if you wanted to. I'm just going through this, which is why my mom just knocked on the door. I told her to come in, say hello, and then leave. So I know that this is long, but we're almost through it, okay? So the Native Americans also have their own form of a New Deal, which is significant and not entirely you could say not entirely unfortunate for the Native American population, because John Collier, who was appointed as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, actually tried to reform harmful practices against indigenous Americans that had been in practice for the past 200 years. And so what John Collier emphasized as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was that all Native American nations were different, were sovereign, spoke different languages. They were not all related. He tried to actually reverse many of the treaties that had been enacted throughout the 19th century in particular that had deprived Native Americans of their land. So think about things like the Dawes Act. John Collier is trying to reverse those. Okay, he was responsible for the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, which restored tribal ownership of land, right? But some tribes, in particular the Navajos, rejected the Indian Reorganization Act because they thought that the Bureau of Indian Affairs was trying to reduce the amount of livestock that they could control. But in general, you could say that the Bureau of Indian Affairs was a move in a positive direction because it was more sensitive to Indian cultural freedom, and it supported the efforts to restore tribal rights among individual language-speaking groups. So it was actually considered to be a step in a positive direction. This is just an image of John Collier actually working with a reservation in Montana. Okay, so how does the Great Depression affect culture, patterns of consumption? In general, these are just a bunch of different, these are some book covers, also sorry about that, just some posters for different musical performances. Okay, so the New Deal actually oftentimes had a very direct effect on American consumption and culture. The New Deal's federal project number 1 provided assistance to artists and individuals. And the Federal Writers Project provided a wide variety of literature programs. It enabled many of the country's greatest writers to survive and go on to prominence. And so in other words, the Federal Writers Project was actually giving money to authors to produce works about the period that they were experiencing. It was encouraging people to write about their time period. The New Deal also funded theatrical, music, and artistic programs. There was a desire to produce some documentary films to chronicle this time period, like The Plow That Broke the Plains, which was a very well-known documentary that was directed by a man named Per Lorenz. So this documentary impulse led many artists to try to record the extent of human suffering that they witnessed. So the Farm Security Administration in particular actually gave photographers jobs to travel throughout rural areas in particular because they had been very devastated by the Depression, and take pictures of what they saw. Okay, so again, this was a government organization, the Farm Security Administration, and they were paying people. And the most well-known photographer, arguably, was Dorothea Lange, who took the migrant mother picture. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But this was one way that they could preserve the legacy of the Depression, and also provide a general, just a general spread of knowledge about how certain areas were so devastated by the environmental calamities that existed around them, like the Dust Bowl. Also, of course, novelists like John Steinbeck, who was the author of The Grapes of Wrath, recorded different experiences of these migrant agricultural workers, like the Okies. So The Grapes of Wrath is about a family from Oklahoma that moves to California in search of a better life. Okay. Actually, before I get into films in particular, just a couple of other things about, before I just really talk about the nuts and bolts of this slide. Many people argue that some written works in particular were starting to take Marxist interpretations. So they were focusing on class conflicts. And they also were kind of criticizing capitalism as a sustainable economic practice. And some communists were also very in tune to the rise of fascism in other countries, in particular Italy and also Nazi Germany, right? And they saw, they were trying to appeal to an anti-fascist movement by forging a popular front and spread their influence. So communists were trying to like tout their own economic style to be a much less severe alternative to fascism, which we saw some countries turning to. Okay, now to movies. Okay, so realize that movies were seen as a more escapist form of culture. So the Hollywood environment tried to avoid confronting controversial social issues head on, and rather they did more indirect commentaries. They did gangster films, screwball, slapstick comedies. Disney films also were produced pretty readily during the Great Depression. So moral tales that kind of stressed following the rules. Comedies, also, as I just mentioned, like Amos and Andy, the Laurel and Hardy movies, ultimately just kind of trying to get people to just take a break from the general economic problems that they face day to day. The radio was also very, very popular in the Depression. Realize that movies were something that you could only actually go to in the theater. People did not have televisions in their houses yet, but people did have radios in their homes. So they became much more popular in the 1930s. Approximately 40% of every American approximately 40% of every American household had a radio in their house by 1930. But still, they focused on older forms of entertainment, like recreating vaudeville shows, black-faced minstrel shows. There were soap operas, daytime radio shows, advice columns like Mary Worth, ultimately just broadcasted over the radio. Realize again, people ultimately consumed the radio. I'll talk about that in a moment, but people ultimately consumed the radio like people consume the TV now. They would crowd around it and listen to it as a family. There were some political and more serious programs that also came out on the radio, and network news was also an important source of information for consumers, but also people were just tuning into the radio for music, for ways to escape. So jazz music was still very popular in the 1930s. There were white performers who were popularizing African American music for a mass audience, which started making swing music more popular. And then this is just an image. I should have talked about this earlier, but just an image of how the Walt Disney films also were becoming a form of escapism. And this is a very, very famous one of the first Disney cartoons that ever came out, just portraying Mickey Mouse for one of the first times. So realize that this was just seen as sort of a fun-loving way to kind of leave the everyday drama of one's life. Okay, so almost done. So realize that by 1937, the New Deal was starting to be criticized by a number of people who argued that it really was not having the overall long-term effects that FDR had planned. FDR was very frustrated with the Supreme Court by 1937 because the Supreme Court had routinely overturned New Deal policies, and so FDR actually initiated his own plan, which was called packing the court, right? What FDR does in the later years of his presidency was he actually increased the size of the court, made it larger, and appointed judges to the Supreme Court who were more favorable to his New Deal programs. This actually was arguably a huge stretch of his constitutional rights. Many people who saw FDR as too extreme, too leftist, or maybe even too much of a dictator took a lot of issues with packing the court. But this was one of the ways that he could get more of his New Deal program's support. Changes for women. Now, women were more engaged in reform work, which allowed them to increase their general influence over the economy. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, FDR's wife, was seen as a key example of this, and she saw herself as a guardian of what she saw as human values. She wanted to ensure that women would be protected rather than lost in a sea of red tape. So she actually tried to get women to be directly involved in economic change and in the general improvement of labor conditions. The first Secretary of Labor, first female Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, was appointed by FDR. And many people argued that this was because of Eleanor's influence. And many women's opportunities came from these social welfare programs. Also, race and the New Deal, very, very significant. Many people argue that the New Deal did not explicitly address race, but and also that there were certain New Deal programs that still allowed for instance, Black or Mexican laborers to make less than their white counterparts, and that maybe African Americans or Mexican Americans were left out of New Deal programs like Social Security. FDR did try to ban discrimination, for example, on the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA projects. He enabled many African Americans to find jobs directly from the WPA. Also, FDR established what he called the Black Cabinet, right? A group of advisors led by a woman named Mary Bethune, who advised FDR on issues that pertain specifically to African Americans. And this opens up a number of jobs available in the federal government for African Americans. And by 1936, this made it so that the majority of African American voters supported the Democratic Party, which is also a huge shift from what we saw during the Reconstruction era. But arguably, the New Deal did very, very little to help Mexicans and Mexican Americans. In 1937, you could say that we enter a period of maybe a final decline in the New Deal programs. In 1937, FDR was convinced that the federal deficit was too large, and so he started to cut spending programs. What this does is it results in a severe recession increased unemployment, and a general loss of popular support for the New Deal. In 1938, the midterm elections result in more Republican strength. Realize that FDR was not up for re-election. This is just congressmen, some senators, but more Republicans were voted into office, and this solidified the idea that maybe further New Deal programs would not be possible. And in 1939, World War II begins, right? Which maybe, if anything, saved FDR's popularity, because he saw the World War II effort as a way that the United States could begin producing, manufacturing towards protecting not only its own economy, but also protecting the continuation of democracy in its allied countries. And of course, we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. Just a couple of graphics to share with you guys here. So this is Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady. Again, very, very significant towards getting more women involved in the New Deal programs in general, but also directly in FDR's cabinet, specifically with the appointment of Frances Perkins. So very, very significant, Eleanor Roosevelt. So the legacy of the Great Depression and the New Deal. You could argue, first and foremost, that the New Deal was one of the largest and in some ways more successful challenges to pure laissez-faire capitalism that existed in the United States history. Yes, it was not ultimately a long-term program. Many people saw the New Deal as just a temporary economic solution to a very severe and unprecedented economic depression. It also, one of the larger legacies was that it increased the power of the presidency. FDR did many things that no president before him would be able to get away with. In particular, strengthening the size of the Supreme Court. This was something that was not written into the Constitution, but FDR still did it. So, and also, of course, realized that FDR was elected for 4 consecutive terms. This made him as close to a dictator as any president that we've ever had in history, before or after, because after FDR's death, we passed a constitutional amendment to make it so that no president after him could serve more than 2 consecutive terms, right? So FDR was a total anomaly in that sense. Also realize that the federal government took more of an incentive in making policy, passing laws, and also providing economic relief to not only organizations, but also individuals who needed it. And also it was dramatically shifting the types of people who were likely to vote Democrat. Before the Great Depression, it was very unlikely that an African American would vote Democrat. But during the Great Depression, the support that African Americans had for FDR in general, because of arguably his black cabinet, his increased attention to African Americans and their specific needs during the Great Depression, made it so that they continued to turn out for the Democratic Party afterwards. And this is going to be increasingly important as we get closer to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. So that is it. Hopefully you guys survived that webinar and took breaks as you needed. I hope you guys have a great break, and if you have any questions about anything that you need to do for the document-based question, feel free to send me an email. All right, that's it. Take care.